I've spent most of my life in the woods. Grew up in a small town where the nearest Walmart was 40 minutes away, and if you wanted entertainment, you had to make your own. My dad was a hunter, my grandfather was a hunter, and by the time I was 12, I was out there too. Not for sport, just for food. Out here, deer season meant a full freezer, and a full freezer meant you didn't have to spend a fortune on groceries. Even after I grew up and moved out, I kept coming back. There's something about the deep woods that gets in your blood. The silence, the way everything slows down, the way you can walk for miles and never see another person. It's peaceful, or at least it used to be. Last fall, I took a solo trip up north, deep into the national forest. I planned for 5 days, just me, my rifle, and the quiet. It was late October, peak rut for white-tailed deer, the perfect time to hunt. I had a spot picked out about 12 miles in, a clearing near a small creek where I had camped before. It wasn't on any marked trails, but I had been there a couple of times and knew how to get in and out without a problem. The first day was uneventful. I hiked in, set up camp, checked the area for signs of deer, found some fresh rubs and a couple of tracks. Good sign. That night, I sat by the fire, ate some beans, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Owls hooting, the occasional rustle in the underbrush, the distant howls of coyotes. Normal, familiar. I turned in early, wanting to be up before dawn to start hunting. That was the last normal night I had. I woke before sunrise, packed some jerky in my pocket, and set out. I moved slow, keeping low, scanning the trees. The ground was covered in frost, my breath hanging in the air. About a mile from camp, I found a fresh deer trail. Big tracks, deep, buck. I followed them for a while, taking my time. Then I saw something strange. Another set of tracks. Not deer, not bear, human. Boot prints deep in the frost, moving in the same direction as the deer. I stopped cold. I was miles from the nearest trail. There shouldn't be anyone else out here. And even if there was, what were the chances they were tracking the same deer as me? The tracks were fresh, maybe a few hours old. I stood there for a long time, listening. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some other hunter had wandered off trail. Maybe I was overthinking it. I moved on. I never saw the deer. By noon, I turned back toward camp. The whole way I felt it, that nagging feeling that I wasn't alone, that I was being watched. But every time I stopped to look, there was nothing. Back at camp, I ate in silence. The fire crackled, sending long shadows across the trees. My rifle sat next to me, close enough to grab. I didn't sleep well. I decided to hike to a ridge about 3 miles west. I had seen deer up there before and figured I'd have better luck. The whole hike, I felt uneasy, like the woods weren't right. Then I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A tree, not broken, not fallen, cut. A clean cut, about waist high, like someone had taken an axe to it. That wasn't what scared me. What scared me was what was on the tree. Carving. A symbol. I don't know how to describe it. Not letters, not something random. Deliberate. Precise. I touched the bark. It was fresh. Someone had been here. Recently. I turned back toward camp. I moved faster this time. I wasn't running, but I wasn't wasting time either. I kept looking over my shoulder. Nothing. But I knew. I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in my lap, listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. A branch snapping. Close. I held my breath. Then another sound. Footsteps. Not an animal. Person. I didn't move. Didn't blink. Then silence. Minutes passed. Then hours. At some point, the fire burned low. I didn't sleep. When the sun finally came up, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed my gear fast. Didn't bother eating. I just wanted to get the hell out. About 5 miles from my truck, I saw something through the trees. A cabin. Not an old, abandoned one. A new one. The door was open. I should have walked away, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to know who had been out here. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I stepped inside. The air was stale. The walls were covered in carvings. the same symbols as the tree. The floor was dirt, stained, dark patches where something had soaked in. Then I saw the chair, a single wooden chair, and the footprints leading to it, then stopping, like someone had been sitting there, watching the door, waiting. I turned and left. I didn't run. Running makes you pray. I walked fast, rifle up. The whole way back, I felt it, the weight of unseen eyes, the presence just beyond my vision. I reached my truck as the sun dipped below the trees, unlocked the door. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the forest, stopping just behind my truck. Not mine. I got in, locked the doors, drove until I hit the highway. I never went back, never told anyone, because I knew, somewhere out there in the deep woods, they were still watching. I've been hunting my entire life. My dad taught me when I was 10, and by the time I was 16, I could track, skin, and butcher a deer on my own. There's something about being out in the deep woods, miles away from everything, that I've always loved. It's not about the kill. It's about the quiet, the stillness, the way the world shrinks down to just you and the trees. But last November, that quiet became something else. Something I still don't have the words for. I was on a week-long hunting trip in a remote stretch of forest up north. The kind of place where the trails are barely marked, and you can go days without seeing another person. That's why I liked it. I had my rifle, my gear, enough food to last me, and a GPS just in case. I planned to set up camp near a small creek I had been to before, about 15 miles in. The first 2 days were normal. I hiked in, set up camp, scouted the area. Saw some deer sign, but nothing worth taking a shot at. The nights were cold, but my sleeping bag kept me warm enough. It was the third day when things started to feel wrong. I was tracking a deer in the morning, moving slow, careful. I had found fresh tracks leading up a ridge, but as I followed them, I noticed something strange. Another set of tracks. Not deer, not bear, human, but they weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. The prints were old, but not too old, maybe a few days at most. They were deep, meaning whoever made them was carrying a heavy pack. But the strange thing was, they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped. No backtracking, no sign of a camp, just a single trail leading up the ridge and then nothing. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of it. There was no reason for someone to hike this deep into the woods and just vanish. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the wind had erased the rest of the tracks. Maybe I just wasn't seeing them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By noon, I had lost the deer trail. I decided to head back to camp, eat something, and reset. But as I walked, that feeling stuck with me. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own boots crunching the frozen ground. I kept checking over my shoulder. Nothing. That night, I built a fire, cooked some beans, and tried to shake the unease. The flames crackled, sending long shadows dancing across the trees. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had spent too much time alone, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, around midnight, I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding. The fire had burned low, casting everything in a dim orange glow. I reached for my rifle, scanning the darkness. Silence. I listened, every muscle in my body tight. Then another sound. Not a branch this time. A footstep. Slow. Deliberate. I've been in the woods long enough to know the difference between an animal moving and a person moving. This was a person. I stayed still, barely breathing. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I waited, gripping my rifle, listening. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally lay back down. I didn't sleep. By morning, I convinced myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe a coyote, something moving through the trees, not paying attention to me. But when I stepped out of my tent, I saw them. Footprints, human, leading from the trees, stopping less than 20 feet from my tent. They weren't there the night before. I packed my gear in record time. I wasn't staying out here another night. By noon, I was moving fast, pushing through the forest, following my GPS back to the trailhead. It was a long hike, but I didn't stop. I didn't eat. I just moved. And the whole time I felt it. That presence. That feeling of being watched. Then, maybe 5 miles from the truck, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A cabin. Not an old, abandoned one like you sometimes find in the woods. This one looked lived in. There was smoke coming from a chimney, a deer carcass hanging from a tree, a pile of logs stacked neatly by the door. But there were no signs of people. No car, no ATV, no footprints in the fresh snow around it. Just the feeling that whoever lived here was watching me. I didn't stop, didn't even look twice. I walked faster, and then, right as I was about to disappear into the trees, I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the cabin's porch. Tall, dressed in dark clothes, face obscured by shadow, just standing there, watching. I didn't run. Running makes you pray. I just kept walking, steady, even, but my heart was slamming in my chest. I forced myself not to look back, not until I was far enough away, and when I finally did, the cabin was gone, hidden by the trees. The figure was gone too, but I knew they were still there, watching, waiting. I made it back to my truck just as the sun was setting. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door. As I climbed in, something caught my eye. A single footprint, right next to the driver's side door. Not mine. I never went back, never told anyone, because I knew, deep down, that cabin wasn't supposed to be there. And whoever lived in it, they were still out there. I've been hunting alone since I was 16. It was never about the trophy or the challenge. It was about the quiet. When you're deep in the woods, away from everything, it feels like the world shrinks down to just you and the trees. No noise from the city, no work stress, no people. Just the sound of your own footsteps and the distant call of birds. This trip was supposed to be like all the others. 4 days in the backcountry, tracking deer, camping under the stars. I had done it 100 times, but this time something was different, something I still don't understand. I parked my truck at the trailhead before sunrise, loaded my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started down the trail. The air was crisp, carrying that early autumn bite. Perfect hunting weather. The first day was uneventful. I hiked about 10 miles in deeper than most people go. I prefer the solitude. I found a good clearing near a creek, set up camp, and settled in. By nightfall, I had a small fire going. The stars were out, the night was still. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. First, I thought it was just the quiet. The woods were too still. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant howls. Just silence. It sat heavy in my ears, pressing against me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my fire, my food. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I slept lightly that night, my rifle within arm's reach. The next morning, I moved deeper into the woods, following fresh deer tracks. I walked for hours, focused on my surroundings, moving slow. Every now and then, I'd stop, listen. Nothing. No birds, no squirrels, not even the sound of insects. Just that thick, unnatural silence. Then I found the first sign that something was wrong. Clearing. Not just any clearing, it looked deliberate. Like someone had cut the trees down in a perfect circle. The stumps were old, covered in moss, but the space itself felt wrong. Like it didn't belong in the middle of the forest. In the center stood a wooden structure. At first, I thought it was an old hunting stand, maybe a blind someone had built years ago. But as I got closer, I saw that it wasn't for hunting. It was a cage, made from thick branches, lashed together with some kind of twine. The door was broken, hanging open. The wood inside was scratched, gouged deep like something had tried to claw its way out. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't normal. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at that broken cage, but eventually, I forced myself to move on. I wasn't about to turn back yet, not over something I didn't understand. But then I found the second thing, pile of bones. At first, I thought it was an animal kill, a deer maybe, but as I got closer, I saw that the bones were different. Too many. Some were small, brittle, like bird bones. Others were larger, but the skulls weren't right. Some of them looked human. I don't remember backing away, but suddenly, I was moving, fast. I wasn't running. Running in the woods is how you break an ankle or get lost. But I wasn't wasting time either. I needed to get back to my camp, pack up, and leave. Then I heard it. A snap. Not a normal twig breaking underfoot. This was deliberate. Close. Too close. I froze, gripping my rifle tight, scanning the trees. Nothing. I waited, listening, every nerve in my body on edge. Then, another sound. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving through the brush just out of sight. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just listened. The footsteps stopped. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels alive. I started walking again. Not toward camp, toward the nearest ridge. I needed to get higher, get a better view of where I was. As I climbed, I kept listening. Every few minutes, I'd stop, hold my breath. Wait. Nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I was spooked by the cage, the bones. Maybe. Then I reached the top of the ridge, and I saw the cabin. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't supposed to be here. It was old, half-collapsed, hidden between the trees. The roof was caved in on one side, the door hanging open. No smoke from a chimney, no signs of life. I didn't want to go near it, but I needed to know. I moved carefully, rifle raised, every step slow. The air was thick, heavy, that same awful silence wrapping around me. The door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, the walls were covered in carvings. Not words, symbols. Some I recognized, most I didn't. The floor was covered in dirt, leaves, and something darker, something that had stained the wood long ago. Then I saw the chair, a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room, facing the door. And on the floor, just in front of it, footprints. Not mine. Fresh. I turned and left. I didn't run. Not yet. I moved quickly, rifle up, scanning the trees. I needed to get back to my camp. Needed to get the hell out of there. By the time I reached my site, the sun was getting low. I packed my gear in minutes, shoving everything into my bag without care. I just needed to move. Then, as I stood to leave, I noticed something. My footprints. I had walked into camp from one direction, but there was another set, coming from the opposite side. Someone had been here, watching. I didn't think. I just started walking, fast. The trail back to my truck was 6 miles, but I didn't stop, didn't look back. I kept my rifle ready, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move. The whole way back, I felt it. The eyes, the presence, something, someone just beyond my vision, keeping pace, never too close, never too far. I reached my truck just as the last light faded. The doors were locked. Nothing had been touched, but as I fumbled with my keys, I saw it, a single boot print, right next to the driver's side door. Not mine. I got in, locked the doors, and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving for hours. I never went back, never told anyone. Some places aren't meant to be found. I always loved hiking alone. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was just peaceful. No noise, no distractions, just me and the forest. I had done it for years, never had a bad experience. That changed last October. I had taken time off work to do a week-long solo trip in a remote national forest. The kind of place where the trails weren't well-marked and cell service was non-existent. I liked those places best. I planned my route carefully, 20 miles in, camped for a few nights, then a different route back. I told my brother where I'd be, packed my gear, and set off early in the morning. The first 2 days were perfect. Cool air, golden leaves, the smell of damp earth. I saw deer, fresh bear tracks, even a bald eagle circling over a lake. I made camp near a small river, cooked a simple meal, and fell asleep under the stars. On the third day, I decided to go off-trail. I had seen an old, faded path branching off the main one the day before. It wasn't on my map, but it looked like it had been used at some point. I was curious. That was my first mistake. The trail was narrow, overgrown, winding deeper into the trees. After an hour, it was clear no one had used it in years. The deeper I went, the stranger it felt. The forest was different here, darker, quieter. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangled like skeletal fingers. I started noticing odd things. An old campsite, long abandoned. A rusted pot half buried in the dirt. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, faded from years in the sun. Then I saw the carvings. Trees with strange, deliberate marks cut into their bark. Not random scratches, symbols. Some were simple, just deep slashes in odd patterns. Others were more intricate, circles, arrows pointing in different directions. I took pictures with my phone, even though I had no service. Something about them unsettled me. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I realized I had made a mistake. The trail had vanished. The deeper I went, the harder it became to tell where the path had been. I tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. Every tree, every rock, every small clearing felt the same. I wasn't panicking yet, but I could feel my heartbeat picking up. Then I found the cabin. It was small, rotting, hidden between the trees. No windows, just a single wooden door slightly ajar. My gut told me to leave, but my brain told me maybe I could find something useful. A sign of where I was, an old map, anything. I stepped inside. The air was thick, stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and decay. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves. A single chair sat in the center of the room, its back to me. Along the far wall, shelves held rusted tools, empty cans, old jars filled with something dark and unidentifiable. But what I noticed most were the bones. Scattered in the corners, half buried in the dirt floor. Small ones, animals, I hoped. But there were bigger ones too. Human? I didn't want to find out. I turned to leave. That's when I heard it. A twig snapping. Not inside, but close. Right outside. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I waited, listening. Nothing. Just thick, heavy silence. I moved slowly, stepping toward the door, rifle gripped tight. Then, another sound. Closer this time. A footstep. Someone was out there. I stayed perfectly still, breathing slow, straining my ears. No movement, no more sounds. Just the feeling of being watched. Then I smelled it. A foul, rotten stench drifted in through the open door. Not dead animal, not garbage, worse. Like old blood and sweat and something sickly sweet underneath. My stomach turned. I had to leave. Now, I stepped out, rifle up, scanning the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, too still. No wind, no birds, no insects. Just that awful smell hanging in the air. Then I saw them. Boot prints. Deep in the dirt, leading from the woods to the cabin. Not mine. Fresh. Someone had been here. Someone was probably still here. I moved fast, not running, but close. I needed to get back to my original trail, find my way out. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched never left. The sun was setting when I found the first trap. A rope snare, half buried under leaves, set along what looked like a deer trail. But it wasn't for deer. It was positioned at chest height, human height. I stepped around it carefully, moving slower now. Someone had set that recently. Then I found the second one. A deep pit, covered with branches and leaves. Sharp wooden stakes at the bottom. Old but still deadly. My skin crawled. This wasn't random. Someone had been living out here. Trapping. Hunting. Not animals. I kept moving. The light was fading fast. Every shadow stretched too long. Every tree looked like a figure standing just out of reach. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to stay calm. I just needed to find the trail. Then I heard it. Not behind me. Ahead. A rustling in the bushes. Slow, steady. Someone moving carefully, deliberately. Not an animal. I raised my rifle, ready. The bushes shifted again. A shape. Human. Tall. just standing there, half hidden by the trees. I didn't wait. I turned and walked fast. I wasn't playing whatever game this was. My only goal was to get out. For the next hour, I moved as quickly as I could, barely stopping, barely thinking. I didn't hear anything else, but I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel eyes on me, always just out of sight. Then finally I saw it. The trail. The real one. The one I had left that morning. I nearly collapsed with relief. I followed it without looking back, pushing myself forward until I reached my campsite. I packed what little I had left and kept moving. I wasn't spending another night out there. The hike back to my truck was brutal. I was exhausted, dehydrated, running on pure adrenaline. But I made it. The truck was just where I left it. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing, a single boot print, right next to the driver's side door. Not mine. I didn't stop to think. I got in, locked the doors, and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't breathe until I hit the highway. I never went back, never reported it. Some things are better left alone. I don't know why I went alone. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe pride. Either way, I was miles deep into the national forest, far from anyone, with nothing but my backpack, rifle, and a dumb sense of confidence. I had planned for a 4-day solo trip, hunting, hiking, just being out in the wilderness. The world had been getting to me, and I needed some quiet. I parked my truck at the trailhead around noon, locked it up, and started down the dirt path with my gear strapped tight. The air was crisp, the kind that fills your lungs and makes you feel alive. Birds chirped in the trees, and the wind whispered through the pines. It was peaceful, the kind of place that made you forget about the rest of the world. The first day was uneventful. I set up camp near a small creek, boiled water, ate a simple meal, and settled in as the sun dipped below the treeline. The woods at night had their own kind of silence. Not complete silence, but the kind where every sound seems sharper. Twigs cracking, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. I had camped alone before, so it didn't bother me much. Morning came and I set out early. The goal was to track deer, maybe get lucky and bag one. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of human activity I saw. No boot prints, no trash, just untouched forest. That's what I wanted, true solitude. But sometime in the afternoon, as I was moving through a thick stretch of trees, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone completely quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just dead, heavy silence. It was unnatural, the kind of quiet that makes your skin prickle. I stopped, listening hard, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. Even the wind had stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe just a predator nearby scaring off the smaller animals. I moved on. Then I found the first sign that something was off. About 50 yards ahead, just past a fallen log, was a small clearing. In the middle of it stood an old tree, dead and rotting, with deep claw marks running down its bark. Not just random scratches, these were deliberate, deep, too high up for any normal animal. I walked closer, studying them. The grooves were thick, rough, like something had dug into the tree with force. My gut twisted. Bears could do that, sure, but something about these marks felt wrong. I took a picture with my phone, though I had no signal. Just something to look at later. Then I heard it. A branch snapped. Not behind me, not far away, close. Too close. I turned fast, rifle up, scanning the trees. My heart pounded in my ears. There was nothing. Just trees, shadows, and silence. I stayed there for what felt like forever, muscles tight, breathing controlled. Then another sound. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crushing leaves just out of sight. I wasn't alone. I don't know why, but I didn't call out. Maybe instinct told me not to. Instead, I backed up, keeping my rifle aimed. The footsteps stopped. The woods remained still. Then I saw it, just a glimpse. A figure partially hidden behind a tree, deep in the shadows. Tall, lean, unmoving. Watching. I didn't stick around. I turned and walked, fast but controlled. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Running triggers predators. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't about to act like prey. I walked for nearly an hour, never stopping, never looking back. My camp was miles away, but I knew I had to get there before dark. The entire time I felt watched. Every few minutes, I'd hear something. A distant footstep, a shift in the trees. I wasn't alone. By the time I reached my camp, the sun was getting low. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my essentials, rifle, flashlight, knife, and packed light. The plan was simple: get the hell out. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. My truck's alarm. Faint, miles away, but unmistakable. Someone was at my truck. Panic surged through me. If someone had followed me this deep into the woods, they weren't lost. They weren't campers, and they sure as hell weren't friendly. I killed my fire, shouldered my pack, and moved fast. I didn't care about leaving gear behind. I just needed to get out. The hike back was brutal. Every few minutes, I swore I heard movement behind me. Quick, light footsteps. Never too close, but never far. I pushed harder, my legs burning, my lungs aching. Then finally I saw it, my truck, parked right where I left it. The driver's door was open. I gripped my rifle tight and approached. My heart pounded in my chest. As I got closer, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Boot prints, not mine, leading from the woods to my truck. The inside was a mess. Glove box open, my belongings scattered. But what scared me most was what was left on the seat. A single old hunting knife, rusted, worn, but placed there deliberately, like a message. I didn't wait to figure out what it meant. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled away, my headlights washed over the tree line. And for just a second, deep in the woods, I saw them. A figure, tall, motionless, watching. I didn't stop, didn't breathe until I hit the main road. I never went back. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get lost. I grew up in the woods. My dad took me hunting before I could even hold a rifle. I spent summers hiking, fishing, camping, learning everything about the land. I knew how to navigate without a GPS, how to read the terrain, how to track animals. I wasn't some city kid who wandered too far from the trail. But none of that mattered out here, because when the forest wants to swallow you, it doesn't care how much you think you know. It started as a solo hunting trip, just like I'd done a dozen times before. I parked my truck at the base of an old logging road in northern Montana, miles away from any town, and hiked in before dawn. I wanted to go deep, away from people, away from trails, away from anything but untouched wilderness. I had my rifle, my pack, my gear, enough food for 5 days, a good tent, and a solid plan. The first few hours were perfect. Cold air, the smell of pine and damp earth, the crisp sound of my boots crunching on fallen leaves. I moved slow, scanning for tracks, checking the wind, listening. Around noon, I spotted fresh deer prints leading down toward a creek. Good size, maybe an 8-pointer. I followed, moving careful, keeping my steps light. That's when I found the first thing that felt wrong. A tree stripped bare, not just missing bark, completely skinned. The wood underneath was pale, smooth, unnatural. I'd seen animals rub against trees before. I'd seen weather-worn trunks, lightning strikes. This wasn't that. Something had taken a knife to it. I crouched down, feeling the surface. The cuts were clean, deep, not fresh, but not old either. A bad feeling settled in my gut, but I shook it off. Maybe an old marker from another hunter. Maybe something else. Either way, I had a deer to track. I kept moving. The trail led me deeper into the woods, past a rocky incline, through a patch of thick undergrowth. The further I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just dead silence. Then I saw the cabin. It was small, barely more than a shack, half hidden between the trees. The roof sagged, the wood dark with age. Looked abandoned. I don't know why, but I felt like I shouldn't be there. Like I had just stepped somewhere I wasn't supposed to. I stood there for a long time, just staring. Then something snapped in the trees behind me. A sharp, deliberate crack. I spun, rifle up, scanning the woods. Nothing. I listened, heart pounding. The silence pressed in. I stayed like that for what felt like forever before I finally turned back the way I came. I didn't look at the cabin again. That night, I camped by a small clearing, far from where I'd been. I built my fire high, cooked some food, tried to shake the unease. But I couldn't. I barely slept. I woke up feeling off. Something about the woods felt different. I packed up quick and started moving. I didn't want to waste another day tracking that deer. I just wanted to put miles between me and that cabin. But no matter how far I walked, the landscape didn't change. Same trees, same ridges, same silence. Then I found the tree again. The same stripped bare trunk from yesterday. I was back where I started. I pulled out my compass. The needle spun wildly before settling in the wrong direction. I turned. The cabin was there, closer this time. I hadn't walked in a circle. I knew I hadn't, but somehow I was back. I felt exposed, standing in that clearing, like something was watching me. I forced myself to move, forced myself to ignore the burning feeling in my gut that told me I had made a mistake coming here. I walked until nightfall. I didn't eat, didn't sleep. I just sat with my rifle in my lap, staring into the dark. I was being followed. I knew it now. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but I felt it, that heavy pressure on the back of my neck, that instinct that told me I wasn't alone. I moved fast, trying to find high ground, trying to get some kind of bearing. But the deeper I went, the more the woods felt wrong. It was like the land was shifting around me, like I wasn't moving through it, it was moving around me. Around noon, I found something worse than the cabin. A second campsite, my fire pit, my tracks, the spot where I had slept the night before. I had been walking in a straight line for hours. I had been sure of it. But somehow, I was right back where I started. I felt sick. I couldn't stay here. I kept walking. Then I smelled it. Rot. Thick and cloying, the unmistakable stench of decay. I followed it before I could stop myself, rifle raised. And then I saw it. A deer, or what was left of one. The body was torn open, the ribcage split wide, the meat stripped clean. No scavenger had done this. No animal had done this. The cuts were too clean, too precise. The air was thick with the smell of blood and something else. Something metallic. I backed away, my skin crawling. And then, in the silence, a footstep. Not an animal. Person. Close. I turned, heart hammering. Nothing. The trees stood still. The silence pressed in. I ran. I didn't stop. Didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed in the dirt, gasping for breath. And when I finally lifted my head, the cabin was in front of me. I don't remember sleeping. I must have, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. But I don't remember closing my eyes. I don't remember dreaming. I only remember the woods. I only remember the feeling of something watching me. I was done. I pulled out my map, my compass, neither made sense anymore. But I didn't care. I picked a direction and walked. The air grew colder. The silence deepened. Then, just as the sun started to set, the road, a dirt road, overgrown but real, and at the end of it, my truck. I didn't question it. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who or what was out there with me. But I know one thing. I'm never going back. I don't know why I thought this was a good idea. I mean, I do. I wanted to prove something to myself, to push my limits. I've always been drawn to the wild, to the quiet that only deep, untouched forest can offer. But there's a difference between appreciating nature and underestimating it. And right now, standing at the tree line with my pack strapped tight, I was starting to think I had done the latter. The plan was simple: 4 days solo in the backcountry, completely off trail. I'd mapped a rough route, but there were no set paths. Just me, my compass, and the land. I had enough food and water purification tablets to last, a sturdy tent, a good knife, and my instincts. I took a deep breath and stepped into the trees. The first few hours were easy. The forest was thick but manageable, the air fresh with pine and damp earth. The sound of birdsong filtered through the branches. and the crunch of my boots on leaves was the only other noise. Felt good, right? By midday, I stopped near a creek to refill my water and check my map. I was making good time. My goal was to reach a small ridge by evening, set up camp, and push deeper in the morning. The sun dipped lower, and I picked up my pace. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. By the time I reached a clearing and set up camp, the silence felt thick, pressing. I didn't think much of it at the time. I made a fire, ate, and sat watching the flames as the sky turned black above me. Then, as I lay in my tent, I heard something, a snap, a single sharp crack of a branch breaking somewhere in the dark. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, probably just a deer. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. I woke to a strange feeling in my gut, like something was wrong, but I couldn't place it. The morning was cold, the fire dead. I packed up quickly, eager to get moving. As I walked, the unease didn't go away. I tried to shake it off, focusing on my route. The forest was getting denser, the trees pressing closer together. Sunlight barely made it through, and the air felt heavier. Around midday, I stumbled upon something odd. Clearing. It was small, unnatural. The trees around it had been cut down long ago, their stumps worn and rotted. In the center, a fire pit, long cold. A few logs arranged in a rough circle. No footprints, no signs of recent use, just emptiness. I didn't like it. I kept walking, but an hour later, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tree with a deep gash in its bark. I had seen it before. I had already passed it. I was walking in circles. I pulled out my compass. The needle wobbled, then steadied. I adjusted my direction, forcing myself to focus. I moved faster. By late afternoon, I saw the clearing again. The exact same one. I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing things, soft rustling, the distant snap of twigs. But every time I sat up, knife in hand, the woods were still. I packed up at first light, moving fast. I was done with this. I just wanted to get back to my truck. But no matter which way I went, the landscape never changed. The same trees, the same dead silence. Then, around midday, I saw it. A cabin. It was old, sagging with age, the wood dark and cracked. The windows were broken, the door hanging slightly open. But there were footprints outside. Fresh ones. I should have kept moving. I didn't. I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust. The floor was covered in leaves and dirt, like no one had been there in years. But in the corner, a backpack, not old. I walked over, unzipped it. Clothes, a water bottle, a knife, no ID. Then, from outside, a footstep. I froze. Another step. Slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife, my heart pounding. The steps stopped right outside the door. Then silence. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. Then slowly the steps retreated. I waited until sunrise before I left. I moved fast, didn't check my map, didn't care about direction. I just walked, and then after what felt like hours, a road, a dirt road, overgrown but real. And at the end of it, my truck. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back. I've always loved being alone in the wilderness. There's something about it. The way the air smells cleaner, the way the trees stretch out endlessly, the way silence wraps around you like a thick blanket. Out here, there's no noise, no distractions, no people. Just me, my gear, and the land. That's why I planned this trip. 5 days solo in the deep woods, no trails, no markers. I wanted to push myself, see how well I could navigate without modern tech. No GPS, just a map, a compass, and my instincts. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off, shouldered my pack, and stepped into the trees. For the first few hours, everything went smoothly. I moved deeper into the forest, following my planned route, keeping an eye on the sun's position. The woods were thick but manageable, the smell of damp earth and pine heavy in the air. Birds chirped, squirrels darted through the underbrush, and the occasional gust of wind rustled the leaves. By mid-afternoon, I found a good spot near a small stream to set up camp. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As I ate, I pulled out my map and checked my progress. I was right on track. As the sun set, the forest changed. The sounds of the day faded. No more birds, no more rustling leaves, just deep, heavy silence. I crawled into my tent and zipped it up. The night air was cool, my sleeping bag warm. My knife was within arm's reach just in case. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it, a single snap of a twig. I held my breath, listening. Silence, probably just an animal. A deer, maybe. I closed my eyes and let sleep take me. I woke at dawn, packed up my gear, and kept moving. The deeper I went, the thicker the woods became. The trees grew closer together, their trunks dark and rough. Sunlight barely made it through the canopy, casting shifting patterns on the ground. By midday, I felt off. The silence was wrong. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves under my boots. Then I found something strange. Clearing. It was small, maybe 20 feet across. The trees around it had been cut down, their stumps old and weathered. In the center, a fire pit, long cold. A few wooden logs arranged in a rough circle. But no footprints, no trash, no signs of recent activity. Something about it made me uneasy. I turned and walked faster. By late afternoon, I still hadn't found my way out. I checked my compass. The needle wobbled, then steadied, pointing in a direction that didn't feel right. Then I saw it. A tree with a deep, deliberate gash in its bark. I had seen it hours ago. I had been walking in circles. I felt a cold sweat break out down my back. I adjusted my course and kept moving. As the sun began to set, I found another clearing. The same one. I woke up exhausted. My sleep had been broken by the sound of rustling in the trees, twigs snapping, something moving just outside my campsite. But every time I grabbed my knife and looked, there was nothing there. I packed up fast and started walking. I didn't care about my original route anymore. I just needed to get out. But by midday, I was still surrounded by endless trees. The landscape never changed. Then I saw it. A cabin. It was old, half collapsed, its roof sagging, its windows broken. It looked abandoned, but there were footprints in the dirt outside. Fresh ones. I should have kept walking, but I was tired, thirsty, desperate for shelter. I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with dust. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves, like no one had been there in years. But in the corner, a modern backpack. I walked over and unzipped it. Clothes, a water bottle, a knife, no ID, no sign of who it belonged to. Then I heard it, a single footstep outside. I froze. Silence. Then another step. Slow, deliberate. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like hours, they turned. Slowly, and walked away. I waited until sunrise before I left. I moved fast. I didn't stop, didn't check my map, didn't rest. I just walked. And then, after what felt like hours, I saw it. A road, a narrow dirt road, overgrown but real. And at the end of it, my truck. I had been lost for days, but somehow, I was right back where I started. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back. I always wanted to push myself. That's why I did solo hikes, long ones, far from trails and crowds. There was something about being alone in the wilderness that made everything feel real, stripped down to survival. This trip was supposed to be my biggest challenge yet. 6 days deep in the backcountry. No marked trails, just me, my pack, a map, and a compass. I had done smaller trips like this before, but never this remote. That was the whole point. I parked my truck at the end of an old logging road, checked my gear, and stepped into the trees. The plan was simple: hike 3 days into the wilderness, then turn around and head back. The first few miles were easy. The forest was thick but beautiful, the scent of pine heavy in the air. The only sounds were my boots crunching on dry leaves and the occasional rustling of a squirrel or bird. By late afternoon, I found a good place to set up camp near a small creek. I built a fire, boiled some water, and sat down with my map to check my route for the next day. Everything was going to plan. As the sun set, the forest changed. The air cooled fast, and the sounds of the day faded. No more birds, no more rustling leaves, just the occasional creak of tree branches shifting in the wind. I climbed into my sleeping bag, listening to the silence. A few hours later, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it, a single snap of a twig somewhere in the darkness. I held my breath, listening. Nothing, just the wind moving through the trees. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe. I forced myself to relax, to ignore the creeping feeling in my gut. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. I woke early, packed up, and kept moving. The forest was thicker now, the trees growing close together, their trunks dark and rough. Sunlight barely made it through the canopy, casting long, shifting shadows. I hiked for hours, keeping my pace steady, stopping only to check my map and drink water. Then, around midday, I found something strange. Clearing. It was small, maybe 30 feet across. The trees around it had been cut down, their stumps weathered and dark. In the center, a fire pit, long cold. A few wooden logs arranged like seats, but no signs of recent activity. No footprints, no trash, no signs that anyone had been here in years. Something about it made me uneasy. The woods felt too quiet. I checked my map again, even though I knew I was still on track. Then I kept walking. By the time the sun started setting, I still felt off. I set up camp near a fallen tree, made a fire, and ate a quick meal. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing sounds, distant cracks, faint rustling. But every time I sat up, knife in hand, there was nothing. Just trees, just darkness. I decided to turn back early. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I packed up and started heading back toward my truck. But something was wrong. By midday, I should have reached a small ridge marked on my map. Instead, the forest just stretched on, endless and unfamiliar. I stopped, checked my compass. The needle wobbled, then steadied. I adjusted my direction and kept moving. An hour later, I was still in the trees. Then I found it. The clearing. The same one. I had walked in a straight line for hours. There was no way I should have ended up here again. A cold sweat broke out down my back. I turned and walked faster. By late afternoon, I still hadn't found my way out. The trees all looked the same, the landscape unfamiliar. Then I saw something up ahead. A cabin. It was old, the wood dark with age, the windows shattered. It looked abandoned, but there were footprints in the dirt outside. Not mine. I should have kept walking, but I was exhausted, lost, and I needed shelter. I stepped inside. The air inside was stale, thick with dust. The floor was covered in leaves and dirt, like no one had been here in years. But there was a backpack in the corner, a modern one, not old. I walked over and unzipped it. Clothes, a water bottle, a knife, no ID, no sign of who it belonged to. Then I heard it, a single footstep outside. I froze. Silence. Then another step, slow, deliberate. I gripped my knife, my heart pounding. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like hours, they turned, slowly, and walked away. I stayed in the cabin until sunrise, too scared to move. When daylight came, I forced myself to leave. I didn't stop walking. I didn't check my map. I just moved. And then, after what felt like forever, I saw it. A road, a narrow dirt road, overgrown but real. And at the end of it, my truck. I had been lost for days, but somehow, I was right back where I started. I didn't question it. I climbed in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who or what was in those woods. But I do know one thing. I'm never going back. I had been planning this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple, solo hiking and camping trip in a remote section of national forest. I wanted solitude, space to clear my head, and a real test of my survival skills. No phones, no GPS, just a map and a compass. I parked my truck at the end of a long dirt road, shouldered my pack, and stepped into the woods. The first few miles were easy. The sun filtered through the trees in golden streaks, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. Birds chirped, leaves rustled, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. I followed a narrow game trail, moving deeper into the forest, further from the roads and trails where most hikers stayed. This was what I wanted, true wilderness. By late afternoon, I found a good spot near a creek and set up camp. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. As the sun set, the air grew colder, and the woods around me darkened. The forest at night was a different place. The usual daytime noises, birds, squirrels, the wind through the leaves, faded. The darkness swallowed everything, and new sounds took over. Distant snapping branches, unseen movements in the underbrush, a low, rhythmic creaking, like tree branches rubbing together, but slower, heavier. I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the wilderness. Still, I kept my knife close when I went to sleep. I woke at dawn, ate a quick breakfast, and packed up my gear. Today, I planned to hike another 10 miles into the forest before setting up my second camp. As I moved deeper into the woods, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first, a creeping unease, a sense that something wasn't right. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the sound of my own footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. Then, around midday, I found something strange. Clearing. It wasn't natural. The trees had been cut down, their stumps old and weathered. In the center, a fire pit, long cold. A few logs had been arranged in a rough circle like makeshift seats, but no signs of people. No tents, no gear, no trash. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, but something about it made me uneasy. The silence pressed in around me. I turned and walked away, picking up my pace. An hour later, I realized something was wrong. The landscape didn't match my map. I should have reached a small ridge by now, but instead, the forest just kept stretching out, the trees all looking the same. I checked my compass. The needle wobbled, then steadied, pointing in the wrong direction. I turned west, trying to correct my course. But an hour later, I was back at the clearing. The same clearing. I had walked in a straight line. There was no way I should have ended up here again. A cold sweat broke out on my back. I turned and walked faster. By the time the sun started to set, I still hadn't found my way out. I set up camp near a fallen tree, forcing myself to eat even though my stomach felt tight with unease. That night, the forest felt wrong. I didn't sleep. Every sound made my skin crawl. The snapping of twigs, the rustling of leaves, the distant, rhythmic creaking that I had heard the night before, but closer now, much closer. The first light, I packed up and started moving. I didn't care about my original route anymore. I just needed to get back to my truck. But no matter which direction I walked, the trees never changed. Then I found the cabin. It was old, half-collapsed, with a sagging roof and shattered windows. It looked abandoned, but something about it made me stop. There were footprints in the dirt outside. Fresh ones. I should have kept walking, but I was exhausted, dehydrated, and desperate for shelter. I stepped inside. The cabin was empty. Dust covered the floor, except for a single path of footprints leading to a wooden table in the center of the room. On the table sat a small, rusted tin can. It was still warm. Someone had been here. Recently, I backed out of the cabin fast, my heart pounding. I needed to get out of these woods. I walked faster, Then I started jogging. Then I started running. Branches whipped against my arms. My boots slammed against the earth. My breath came in short gasps. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to move. Then I saw it. A road. Narrow, overgrown, barely more than a dirt path, but a road. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward it. Then I saw the truck. My truck. I was back where I started. I had been lost for 3 days, hiking miles in what I thought was a straight line. But somehow, I had ended up right back at my truck. I didn't question it. I just climbed in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I'm never going back.